There are a lot of different types of cover that bass relate to. Bass love wood, bass love rock, and bass love vegetation. But probably one of the most consistent pieces of cover that bass always seem to relate to are lily pads. No matter if you live in Florida, California, or New York, lily pads can be found in lakes, rivers, and ponds across the nation. Over the years, we have seen several major tournaments won by fishing lily pads. Now, whether you are a tournament fisherman or a recreational angler, fishing massive lily pad fields that sometimes stretch on for miles can be extremely overwhelming. So learning how to break down pads and throw the right lures is going to make you a better angler. This video is brought to you by Sportsman'sOutfitters.com. Right now, Sportsman's Outfitters is having their cabin fever sale. If you're locked up at home like me and you want to save some money on some of your favorite lures, click the links down below in the description and you can pick up some of your favorite lures at the best price. Now, when it comes to fishing, a lot of guys like to talk about lures, and lures are extremely important when it comes to fishing pads, but if you are not putting your bait in the right area, you're simply not going to get bit. So let's first talk about 5 high percentage areas that bass can be found in lily pads. Now, there are several different types of pads, and sometimes they grow in a little bit different ways, but no matter what type of pads that you are fishing, one of the key places that bass are going to be found is on the edge of the pads. Pretty much anytime you fish vegetation, bass really like a hard edge. So if you can find an edge, a place where the lily pads stop growing, that is a perfect place for a bass to ambush prey that is swimming by. Now, whether this is an outside edge or an inside edge, you should always concentrate some time while fishing lily pads on the edge. Now, with that being said, there are places that you're going to fish where an edge of lily pads just continues to go, and it's very monotonous and it's very straight. Now, there's no doubt that bass could be somewhere along that long straight edge, but if you can find a point or a pocket of lily pads along that edge, that is going to be an even higher percentage area where bass are more than likely to be found. Now, a point is literally one of the best places to find bass on any lake. Whether it's rock or clay or mud banks, a point is a great place for bass to be able to ambush prey. And it's no different when it comes to lily pads. If you're going down a section of lily pads and you see 2 or 3 points that kind of stick out a little bit further than the rest, those are the places where you should really concentrate sometimes and really soak a lure. Now, the exact same thing can be said for pockets. Anytime you have a pocket, it pretty much acts like a funnel. Bait fish and bluegill that are going to be going by are literally going to be funneled right to where that bass is sitting. So although an edge is great, one thing you should always concentrate on is points and pockets in the lily pads. Another high percentage area that you should focus on when you're fishing lily pads is anywhere where you have other types of vegetation mixing with the lily pads. This can really be a number of different things. For instance, you may be fishing a giant lily pad field, but there's 2 or 3 clumps of reeds that are kind of mixed in with these lily pads. Where those reeds and lily pads meet can be a very high percentage area where you can catch a bass. For instance, if you take a look at this video clip right here, I have a very small patch of peppergrass that's mixed in with some pads. I've been fishing a lot of pads that day, but as soon as I saw this peppergrass, I pitched over to it and caught a bass. Here's another spot where I was fishing a giant, massive lily pad field, but if you look just in front of the boat, there is a very small hyacinth mat. I tossed my bait up near this hyacinth mat, and this is what happened. Nice one too. Very nice. The biggest thing here is just use your eyes. You may be able to see patches of reeds here or a mat here, but sometimes that mixture of vegetation is actually happening under the water. I have seen at times where you have small clumps of hydrilla that are mixing in with the pads. Now, as long as the hydrilla doesn't completely choke out the pads, where you have this mix of cover is going to be, again, a dynamite place to catch a bass. Now, speaking of fishing these massive fields of lily pads, one of the biggest things that I actually look for is a void of lily pads, also known as a hole. In this video, I was actually fishing a giant, I mean absolutely massive flat of lily pads. But amongst all these lily pads, there was little open spots, there was little holes, there was little voids among the lily pads that held a lot of bass. This is basically like a dinner plate. This is a place where bass can come to feed. Now, sometimes you will actually catch bass in the middle of the hole, but sometimes they're just gonna be relating to the outside edge of that hole and ambush prey as it comes by. Now, that's obviously a pretty big hole in the pads, but if you're fishing in the spring, especially if you know that the bass are spawning, I really like to find these small 3 and 4 foot wide holes. In this video, I was simply targeting one of those very small holes. I was able to catch bass that were actually set up on beds in these holes. So anytime you're fishing extensive flats of lily pads, concentrate sometimes in those holes. Now, the 5th high percentage area, and actually probably one of my favorite places to catch bass in lily pads, is anywhere you have a small isolated clump. Sometimes it might be an isolated clump that is along the bank, but what you see a lot of times is you will have massive flats of lily pads, but kind of just off of these lily pads, there will be small little clumps. And these small clumps almost always hold bass.
Very, very nice. Yes. Look at that.
Now that we know some high percentage areas that we can focus our time when it comes to fishing lily pads, let's talk about what lures to fish in lily pads. You're almost always going to get hung from time to time while fishing in lily pads because those lily pads have that little butthole in them. If you guys have fished pads a whole lot, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's that little notch in the lily pad. I don't even know why lily pads are shaped that way, but if you fish lily pads, almost no matter what lure you're gonna fish, you're gonna get caught in the butthole from time to time. Moving on to the lures. The first 2 lures that I'm gonna mention here are actually kind of my preferred lures to find bass in the grass. This is when I'm not exactly sure where the bass are. This is when I'm locating the bass. I'm focusing on those high percentage areas. The first one is going to be a Gambler Big Easy. I don't know why, but it seems like a lot of people in Texas and in Florida fish this bait, but people elsewhere across the United States don't seem to always fish the Gambler Big Easy. This is a bait that can really mimic a shad, it can mimic a bluegill, it can mimic a shiner. If you hook it up on this Gamakatsu weighted hook, it really comes through pads extremely easy. Now, you may be thinking that because you're fishing a 5.5, 6 inch swim bait that you're only gonna catch big fish on this lure, and that's simply not the case. You will catch bass of all different sizes with that Gambler Big Easy. To me, it actually will come through the cover a little bit better than a swim jig, although a swim jig is also a great option. The next lure, and also one of my favorites, is a horny toad. The thing that I really like about a horny toad is the tails, the little flappers of the actual horny toad. They're not huge and they don't tend to catch on a lot of stuff. So you can really bring it through pads fairly easily. Now, I'm always gonna fish both the Gambler Big Easy and a horny toad on braided line. Typically 50-pound braid is what I prefer. Now, one of the most important things that you should know about these 2 lures is, again, these are search baits. And yes, you are going to catch fish on these baits, but the big thing that I'm trying to find out is, are there bass present in the area that I'm fishing? I don't necessarily have to hook up and actually catch bass with these baits. I'm just trying to cause a reaction. If I get a bass that blows up and hits that Big Easy or the horny toad but doesn't get that bait, it may have told me, hey, there are bass in this area. When I know there are bass in an area, whether I catch them or whether I get a couple of blow-ups, that's when I'm going to slow down. Now, when it comes to slowing down in pads, one of the best options that you're going to have is a simple Texas rig. Honestly, it may not even matter what you put on the back of that Texas rig. I've caught bass in pads on Texas rig crawls, worms, tubes, beaver style baits. Now, with that being said, one of my favorite Texas rig baits to use in pads is some sort of worm. If you fish, for instance, like a 6.5 inch straight tail worm, it really slides into the cover extremely nice. But the other thing that I like about it is that a lot of times that worm is gonna stand up a little bit on the bottom, and The thing about pads is pads don't always grow on a hard bottom. A lot of times they're actually going to grow on a silty or soft bottom. So having a worm that kind of sticks up a little bit, I think that will actually help you to get more bites when you're fishing in pads, because the bass don't always like to go and pick stuff off a silty bottom. Now, with that being said, this actually brings me to what I'm starting to fish a lot more in pads, and that is a Tokyo rig. A Tokyo rig is kind of like a mini drop shot, and it really allows your bait to kind of just stick off the bottom a couple of inches. So again, if you're fishing in pad fields where that bottom is a little bit softer, using that Tokyo rig is gonna help suspend that bait off of the bottom a little bit. Now, one of my favorite baits to use on a Tokyo rig is a Missile Baits quiver worm. This is a straight-tailed worm, but it has a little bit of a flap on it, and it really has a great action on a Tokyo rig. Now, I keep referring to soft bottoms and hard bottoms a lot, and real quick, it seems like in Florida, a lot of places that are the best to catch bass in pads have a sand or harder bottom. Especially if you're fishing in the springtime when the bass are on beds, you really want to find that sandy bottom. But what I found fishing other states, even like my home state of Ohio, is that you don't always need to have a hard bottom to catch bass. Now, one lure that I would definitely suggest to fish in pads is a weightless soft stick bait of some sort. A lot of times while fishing pads, I've actually seen it where bass won't hit Tokyo rigs and Texas rigs because a lot of times those bass will actually suspend and they'll be just below those pads, and sometimes your lure is just going to fall past them too quickly. Now, sometimes they are going to get it before it goes down too quick. In those situations, I really like to fish a soft stick bait, something that is weightless, something that I can pitch into holes and little openings in the pads and really just let that bait do its thing. Let it sink really slowly, and you're going to be able to pick off those bass that are kind of suspended just below the pads. The next lure is kind of an unconventional lure to fish around pads, but it's something that I have seen to work extremely well, especially during the springtime when the pads really aren't extremely thick. Now, this is gonna depend on where you live in the country. In a lot of states, pads will kind of die down during winter months, and then they kind of start to spring or sprout up during that springtime. And before the pads get extremely thick, one of the best lures to fish is a shallow running square bill crankbait. I'm telling you what, you would be shocked at actually how well a square bill will come through pads. Now, again, this is not very thick, dense pads. This is pads that are a lot more sparse. It's a lure that a lot of bass aren't seeing, and I'm telling you what, it is a phenomenal way to catch some big bass with a square bill. Now, the last lure that I use a lot is some sort of chatterbait. Now, when I'm fishing the chatterbait, I'm usually relating to kind of that edge of the pads, or I'm fishing it around sparser pads like I talked about with the crankbait. Now, lily pads are considered emergent vegetation, which means they come out of the water. But one of the other best pieces of cover that bass relate to is submergent vegetation like hydrilla and milfoil. And I actually kind of made a submergent grass fishing masterclass. I'm gonna link it right here. If you guys want to learn more about submergent vegetation, you can click on that video, and don't forget to check out the links below for all the lures that I talked about today. Comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.